everyone to another episode of Wrestling with God. I'm Isha, and I am very excited and honored to have a very special guest today, Evan Cummings. Evan is originally from Rochester, New York. He is presently living in Manhattan, and he is a director and a playwright and a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University. His major was directing as part of the drama program at Carnegie Mellon. And Evan, I'm thrilled to have you with us. And just for full disclosure, I have to say that Evan is also my stepson and my favorite oldest and my favorite youngest and my favorite middle stepson, because he's the only stepson I have. But putting that aside, Evan is really one of the people I admire most in the whole world. And he has a dear place in my heart. And he's truly one of the people that inspires me in many ways. So welcome, Evan. I'm glad that you're with us. Why don't you just tell us a little bit more about yourself, fill in some of the blanks there.
Sure. Well, thanks, Craig. Thank you for asking me to be a part of this, and for allowing me to kind of, even in advance of this, wrestle with the thoughts that might be worth kind of thinking about in advance of a conversation like this. I think you covered a lot of kind of my background and my primary work focus. The theater and the arts is the thing that I've dedicated my life to, and it's the idea of storytelling and the ways that can give people a positive afternoon or evening in the theater, and even the ways that sometimes theater and the arts can change people's lives or make positive change in people's day to day and kind of the way that they see the world. I did grow up in Rochester. I grew up in what I think is a really strong and vibrant cultural community, and so I did performance in theater from very young. I did my first exploring of what it might be to be a theater director in Rochester as an assistant director at Jiva Theater and some other programming that was around in places like the Jewish Community Center and other community theater opportunities. And indeed, I went to Carnegie Mellon. I had applied there both as an actor and for their directing program. And I think one of the unique things about the cultural community in Rochester is I found another significant part in the story of my life, which I imagine we can get into a little bit more, but I do use a powered wheelchair, and I've been a wheelchair user since my teenage years. I had an injury a couple days before my 14th birthday, and I'm happy to talk more about that, and that in context of anything we might talk about further. But I bring that up as just a little bit of background to my history to say I ended up feeling really kind of supported by the theater makers and other people as I was learning what it was to be a part of theater and the arts. There were a lot of people that were encouraging after I had my injury to say the arts is something that you still can do, right? It was not a situation where I was an athlete or somebody who worked a particular trade that's a kind of physical commitment that I wouldn't be able to do in the aftermath of this injury. And so I've always really appreciated growing up in the community that I did, with the family support and the community support and the friend support that I did. And the fact that I live in New York City now is certainly nothing against the Rochester area. It's just that that's where the kind of all the arts come together in a way, and so as you say, I am primarily directing for the theater, but I also have developed the playwright side of myself over the last 5 or 6 years, and have had a few plays that I've written be produced, and do other work, not at a specific theater, but kind of wherever will have me, and wherever the most interesting stories that kind of draw me to the project might be taking place. So.
One of the things I know that you've been working on a lot in the last few years with a lot of intensity, Evan, is bringing actors with disabilities into your plays and into stage productions.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, it's and to be honest, it's actually even expanded out a little bit further in some of the more recent projects I actually did. The theater's coming back from this COVID era, and it's been such a strange and uncertain time for live theater and live performance. But I was thrilled that actually the first thing that I came back to do in showing up in a live space and doing theater that wasn't kind of Zoom based, because there was a lot of that going on over the last 2 years, was at Lincoln Center. They did a performance series that was outdoors, and they called it the Restart Stages, and essentially bringing stage performance back to life, and in their beautiful, the Lincoln Center Plaza is kind of known as, nationally, if not worldwide, as a kind of place for the arts, where they have the symphony and the opera and the ballet, and a major theater performance space there. And some of that work was actually with writers with disabilities, a number of actors who identified as having a disability. And I guess maybe an interesting thing about the evolution of that was it was actually something that I kind of maybe pushed against is not the right phrasing, but maybe it is. As I was starting to get into the kind of professional world, recognizing that part of my identity is someone with a disability. I use a wheelchair. And yet it didn't necessarily affect how I was able to, the kind of work that I was able to do, right? As I've kind of evolved over the years, the thing that I've recognized is, in a lot of ways, the opportunities that are available to directors and writers and actors and artists of other kinds, sometimes those opportunities aren't as forthcoming to people with experiences of disability. And so not only have I started to discover, wonderful friendships and really positive collaborations with artists who identify as disabled. Part of the reason that I have explored that work and wanted to explore work with actors that are developing their craft was to kind of recognize in something of a hopeful way I think a little bit more openness to telling stories of people with just a wide variety of different identities and experiences, and that includes people with disabilities, right?
Would it be safe to say, Evan, that you are a pioneering presence in terms of opening the theater to people with disabilities and giving them a voice and giving them a stage to express their art in their craft?
Yeah, I love the idea that I would be at kind of a pioneering stage of that. Like I'm there at the ground level as some of this is starting to develop, and these actors and other artists are getting more opportunity. I would be foolish to say that I was and only, or one of the few only driving forces of that. But I've found my way to some different theater companies and different communities of people that are trying to move the needle when it comes to greater representation and greater inclusion. So I would point to a theater company called the Queen's Theater, which I've worked with a lot in this space, especially. It's really only some of these larger organizations that have a little bit more of a voice and reach than I necessarily have as an individual artist, to be able to kind of make a statement within this kind of arts and theater industry and say, this is something that's important to us. This should be important to you as well. Confident and grateful to be a voice in that dialogue, and I can only do it though with the people around me that
Sure.
are making those choices.
Sure. So I'm going to segue, but still moving in the same general direction. It's an observation that I would make is that you have taken the challenges that have come with your own disability, your own injury, and you have, again, an observation, you have navigated through those waters with such dignity, such grace, such intelligence, and now you're using that same intelligence, dignity, and grace to help other people who may have, parallel challenges. Yeah. So let me ask this question. If I can just share a little bit of what I know about your background. Again, 2 or 3 days before your 14th birthday, you jumped off your family deck to make snow angels for your 2 younger sisters, Tori and Alana, and you severed your spinal cord, and essentially you have been paralyzed from your shoulders down ever since. And again, watching you, knowing you, that you have walked through the challenges that you have with great dignity, grace, and intelligence, and in fact have used them to not only help yourself, but help others. What were the narratives or stories or that helped you through that difficulty, through the challenges that you face to this day?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question, and honestly, there's something of an answer even in the way that you phrase the question, which is if I look back to the actual circumstance that through which I broke my neck and had my spinal injury. Yes, I was jumping into a bank of snow in the backyard and making snow angel figures. I don't know that I necessarily, even in that moment, was thinking this is to show my sisters, but something of a narrative came out of that experience that maybe is kind of true in a bigger sense, but that actually was a narrative that evolved from that experience, right? Also, like I'm not sure that it really matters all that much one way or the other. It was a jump from an area where a deck or a porch might be, but a little bit of a step in the back of the house, right? And I just say that to bring up the idea that we create narratives for ourselves, don't we?
Yes.
In the retelling of the circumstances of our lives, and I think that's a huge part of the way that I connect to theater and the arts, which is trying in the work that I do to find something true and retell it in a narrative way that allows people to connect to it even more fully than they might have before, right?
Well, yeah, one of the things I have really grown to appreciate, and largely through you and also your mom, who has a love of theater, is that, and maybe Shakespeare would be a good example, is that there are ways that theater the arts can be more true than life itself. And what
Yeah.
do I mean by that? Again, just using Shakespeare's, that he distilled in a play, in a stage production, truths that we all experience, but over a lifetime. And he distilled them in such a way and in a story that actually made them more powerful. And I think that's part of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And
Shakespeare's a great example. I mean, he actually didn't really write any of his plays. None of his plays were kind of original story ideas. Like, he pulled from stories that had existed in the folklore, in written form in other ways, from the history of different people that had lived. And yet, like you say, it's in a big way, it's all in the way the story is told, because in there lies the truth and the connection.
Yeah, and they're told in such a way that it's almost like a magnifying glass. It brings all the truths together in one powerful moment on stage that makes it more real and therefore more informative. One of the things that I have done, I think, a number of times with you, when your mother and I have seen a movie or a play that really touched me, I've called you up a few times and said, you really do have a noble profession. Keep going. Because, and I see this in my work as both a psychotherapist and as a meditation teacher, that we all have stories. We all have narratives. Some of them are conscious, some of them are unconscious. And those narratives will either bless us or curse us in terms of how we deal with life's challenges. And one of the things that you said that I thought was very interesting a few minutes ago, that you participated in the development of your narrative around your injury.
Sure.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I think most people don't see it that way. Things happen to them and they don't necessarily see how they are weaving the narrative or the story around the facts of their life. So can you say a little bit more about how you did that and how you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, some of it is how do we kind of in real time work through the most uncertain or painful or unpredictable or difficult moments that we face, right? And
Yes.
I think so much of that is, to a certain degree, it maybe is the narrative that we tell ourselves, right? That we, at any point, we could either be the protagonists of our own lives or possibly even an antagonist in somebody else's story, right?
Yes. Or we can be the antagonist in our own story.
We can, certainly we could.
Yes.
And so I feel like, there was, I don't know exactly where it came from. I think in some of the ways that I mean, let's put it this way. I was a home without anyone else home, and I decided to jump into the snow in the backyard, right? I'm the only one that had the firsthand experience of what that was, and frankly, the firsthand experience of what it was to be lying in that circumstance, face down in the snow, unable to move, with uncertainty even to the science and medicine of what was happening in my body at the moment. I was young. I was, in a way, just being a kid, in making that choice to jump out into the snow. And yet, even there is another kind of narrative to say, all right, what explains this choice? What explains this circumstance? And when you're telling a story, for the stage or written or anything else, when you're fictionalizing something that is truth that's coming from you, some of those things need to be explained. That's what makes the best story, to allow your audience to kind of follow along with you and not get lost or confused, or to really connect with the things that you're trying to say. But I think it's just recognizing whether any individual is an artist and a creator or not, recognizing the value and the ways that it can be a positive driver to kind of consider what the narrative of your own story is, you know?
Yeah, you're saying something that I think is so powerful and has so many applications. Again, is that we have the capacity to choose and maybe even to create the narratives that are going to guide us in our lives. If I can just share a personal story, some people know that Franciscan priest Richard Rohr has been a spiritual mentor to me. And this was many, many years ago. Over 30 years ago, he was here in Rochester. And I remember where we were driving the car on Park Avenue in Rochester. And he turned to me, and I had a very difficult childhood, and I won't go through all the details. My mother died when I was young, and I was homeless for a while. And anyway, so Richard turned to me and he said, it's a good thing you had the childhood that you had. And again, this is 30 years ago. I was going to weekly psychotherapy and and I looked to him and I said, how can you say that? And he said, I know you had a difficult childhood. He said, but you're very gifted and you're very intelligent. If you weren't wounded, you'd just be another yuppie making lots of money and contributing nothing to the world. But because you are wounded, you become a wounded healer and you're making a difference. Maybe you had the childhood you were meant to have. And a light bulb went off. It was a change in my narrative.
Yeah.
Rather than seeing myself completely as a victim of my childhood, somehow to see that perhaps my childhood had shaped me, even the pain had shaped me in a positive way. So that's why I'm just picking up on this theme of narrative, and that we have a choice about the narratives we choose to use to interpret the events of our life and to guide us forward.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this question in that context, Evan. Do you have a favorite narrative or a meta narrative that guides your life?
I don't think I can point to one. I do think that the narratives that I'm most drawn to are about community, I think I would say. Like, I would use that term, the idea of community, both as kind of could be geographic, could be a matter of place and experience. It could be a community of people that have experienced similar things in life due to matters of identity, including race, including disability, and others. It's funny. I'm actually I'm thinking about some of the storytelling that I've been drawn to or I've found interesting, most interesting in my life. You mentioned Shakespeare, and I think that's a great one. Just in the way that he didn't travel to many of the places that he even in different places in Italy, for example, that he wrote about. He didn't travel to all of those places, right? He made up a circumstance that happened in the place that they did. One of my favorite kind of writers from a long time ago is Washington Irving, who grew up. He wrote about Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman, right? But he grew up north of New York City and in New York City. And he recognized when he was writing, actually one of the first, if not the first, Americans to be able to make their living only through being a narrative writer. And he created the word Gotham as a name for New York City. He created this family of Knickerbockers, which obviously is a name that we know through the basketball team now, among others. And he did all that because he recognized there was not a foundational narrative of New York City at the time. New York City, arts and finance and culture, center of those things. It was that then as it is now. And so he created a narrative and he created character that were all fictional, but that gave a sense of this community that he was living in and growing in. And some of the narratives that I've enjoyed or that I have really found rewarding to build in my theater work have actually been tied to different places and communities that I've been in. I think you know this, but for your listeners, in addition to some of the work that I do here in New York, whenever possible and when the opportunities arrive, I like to find myself in other cities across this country. There are regional theaters that do interesting work, and sometimes it's work that is coming out of New York, but sometimes it's stuff that's based in what is it like to live in those places, and how is it different from some of these kind of major cultural centers and major theater centers in the country. And I have an international company that I was one of the founders of that is a number of directors from different places, including Germany and Italy and Israel and Taiwan. We have a director from Taiwan, and I've actually been to a number of these different places, been to Rome, been to Taipei, and found the opportunity to work with actors and other artists that have grown up in those places and lived there all their lives, or a good portion of their lives. So I think it gets me to ask, kind of to your question, the question that I ask myself in return is, what is it about the dynamics of a community, I think, that make a good story? And so I feel like whatever kind of community means to me in a given project or a play that I'm considering directing, often that's the way that I start to connect with that story to start to discover how to build out that narrative.
All right, so I had this thought while you were talking. I could hear your creative abilities working, and that your creative abilities are always at some level working, whether it's in the context of theater, building community, how community impacts us, and in your own personal life. So again, I'm just fascinated with this whole idea of creativity and the ability to nurture in a conscious way our narratives and to grow them and to shape them. So let me kind of use that, Evan, to segue a little bit into something that is maybe a little bit more explicitly or concretely spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about that creative capacity in all of us. And, mostly we're talking about it right now in terms of the narratives we buy into and the narratives that we help to shape and create. But there's something about that creative capacity in all of us that I don't think can be explained by material science. I don't think we can explain it as some sort of epiphenomenon, a coincidental result of activity in the brain and the nervous system. How do you explain, how do you capture, how do you describe that creative spirit that is so alive in you? And do you see it as in some way reflecting something metaphysical about us or transcendental about us as human beings? It's a big question.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Could you say just a little bit more about, I guess, the idea of the metaphysical or transcendental, how you would describe that, so I can kind of assess whether that connects with my ideas about that?
Sure. If a person who is wholly materialistic, and what I mean by that, somebody who just thinks that there is nothing but physical matter, physical creation, physical reality, and that our consciousness, our thoughts, our feelings are really just coincidental artifacts of biochemical reactions in our brains and in our nervous systems. So when I'm talking about something metaphysical, it's that there is something beyond the material. Like we can talk about love, the experience of love, for example, and talk about what happens in somebody's biochemistry when they're feeling love. But we all know that the experience of love is bigger than just biochemistry.
Yeah.
So I'm saying there's something non-material, there's something metaphysical about the creative process.
Yeah.
Does that help?
It does. Yeah. No, and as you're talking, I mean, it really strikes me that I suppose the person that you describe as believing just in the physical and the material, and that our entire experience is only has to do with science and chemistry and does not extend to a greater, I guess, spiritual belief. I'm sure that that person exists. I'm sure many people look at it from that perspective. I would say I don't look at it from that perspective, but there's a lot of space between that extreme and a particular kind of spiritual belief, a particular following and connection to the world, specifically through the ideas or tenets of a certain religion, right?
Yes.
And I don't identify and connect with things to that extreme either, right? There are so many different alternatives and possibilities between those two poles, right? And I guess I don't know exactly where I fall within there, but I guess let me say I do find something spiritual and something larger than myself in the idea of creative narrative and creative storytelling.
Oh, I've heard so many artists, musicians, even scientists say that what they have created doesn't come from them, it comes through them. And I do think, this is maybe, I've never quite said it this way before, but to be intentionally engaged in a creative process is a spiritual practice, whatever we mean by spiritual practice.
Sure.
It is as if we're tapping into something transcendental, something bigger than our ordinary states of consciousness. Something bigger is happening. There's a stream that we are flowing in, and that is flowing through us.
Yeah.
Let me say it this way. In my work in counseling, but also in teaching meditation and yoga, there are many young people who reject the notion of that I call it a propositional understanding of God. That God is this, God is that God is a superhero in the sky. Yet they have an intuitive sense that the word God is pointing to a reality and energy that people can tap into, and that people can know in an experiential way. So what I like to say is that whatever God is, it's not a proposition. We don't know it propositionally. We know it by participating in it.
Yeah.
So for example, when you jump into that stream of creativity, which I actually think you live from that most of the time, I think whether you label it that way or not, you are tapping into something, again, beyond the five senses, even beyond the limits of the rational mind. You are tapping into, and I mean this is a metaphor, I guess, you are tapping into a river of grace or something like that.
Yeah, I was thinking about a word or a framing that you used in talking about all this just now, which was, the practice, a practice of the funny phrase version is, yes, I grew up Catholic, and I'm a lapsed Catholic, or I grew up in whichever religion.
A recovering Catholic.
Right. What's the opposite of that, or what's a version that's someone who is more fully and habitually a part of their faith. I'm a practicing,
Catholic,
fill
Jew,
in
whatever.
the following and the thing that connects to that particular person, right? I do feel like there's a ritual, right? There's a ritual to these things that we do to bring us closer to the potential of that God experience, right?
Yes,
And that, why build in that ritual to our lives if not for the possibility that you could find your way to that sublime moment, that perfect kind of synergy that allows you to feel, oh, that was a moment of kind of perfect spiritual harmony, right?
yes, yes,
And I really do kind of recognize that. And I'm a theater practitioner, right? My
yes.
practice is theater. And we even call it, we call it rehearsal. We call it, we're practicing our lines so that we can be ready for opening night, right? That ritual, that rhythm, that individual connection to what it means to, in the case of an artistic creation, better develop your craft, right? And I think in spiritual and religious practice, to better kind of prepare yourself or develop your internal connection, for the possibility of the spiritual moment,
See how this fits, because you got my mind going in a good kind of direction here. There's a stream of consciousness, and I'm going to bring two worlds together.
Mhm.
If we go back to the beginning of the Bible, Genesis, God is pretty much seen as a creator.
Mhm.
And again, I don't interpret Genesis as historical truth, but I do think it's a sort of meta truth.
Hmm.
Um, and so
It's
God
an
is
it's a
this.
narrative, right?
Yes, it's a narrative. Yeah, yes. And that we're also, so you have God as the creator, and then we're told that we are made in the image and likeness of God.
Hmm.
So that I think we are most godlike when we are creating, when we are in that
Yeah,
process of
sure.
creating. And what I try to express to people, both people that come to me for counseling or spiritual direction, is that, and I think this ties into what you were talking about with theater and rehearsing, is that the way that we become uncreative and ungodlike, if I can say it that way, is when we fall into habitual mechanical thinking,
Sure.
just kind of being half awake. And that spiritual practice, creativity, being in a creative flow means being awake and aware at all times so that we can be in this flow of creative energy.
There's an idea that I think I really kind of subscribe to or live by, as far as an approach to directing or what it means to work through a rehearsal process for a play, right? Kind of looking at it from the perspective of an actor, for example. You learn the lines, you communicate with the director in space to say not only what is the story that we're trying to tell with this whole 2 hour play, but what is the story in each particular moment, right? And all so much of that has to do with, all right, what is the dialogue being said? What's the dynamic between these two characters? How are they related to each other? What is the set and the surroundings look like? How do we light this moment? Is it dark and eerie? Is it bright and comedic, and on and on? And all of those things come together to kind of move towards the potential that every thought and every idea and every design and every preparation that went into that particular moment has the potential of communicating something honest, something real, and something true to the audience at that given moment, right?
Yes.
And in the best directing experiences that I've had, that moment is communicated to the audience as closely as possible to how I intended it to be communicated.
Yes.
And in a step beyond that, which honestly I don't know that I've yet experienced in my work in the theater, that moment becomes something else and something above even what the hope and the preparation and the let's all be in agreement on the story that we're telling. It becomes something spiritual. It becomes something that couldn't have been expected, that couldn't have been planned for, that was everything coming together in a certain way to not only be the thing that we hoped it would be, but to be the thing that we couldn't have possibly anticipated it to be.
Well, I again, I think you're hitting on something that is very powerful. Let me give a parallel. As a psychotherapist, sometimes people will come to me and they will say, I want to learn to control my dreams when I'm sleeping. And I say, that's a very bad idea.
Yes.
And they say, why? I said, because if you're controlling what happens in your dreams, then nothing creative or insightful is going to come through your dreams. So what you were saying, yes, you have this vision of what you want it to be, a stage performance, and you put all the time and energy and effort and intelligence into it, and it approximates that. But there's always this possibility that it will go even beyond what you imagined. And that openness to that is I would say is actually something spiritual without, becoming religious. It's something transcendental, that you're in the flow of something bigger than yourself, that takes yourself and all the work that you put into it, but creates something bigger and larger than you even imagined.
Yeah.
That is the epitome of, I think, creativity and a pure example of spiritual process.
Yeah. I find it interesting, and I'm not a therapist. I have such huge respect for what you and my mother do, and yet recognize that somebody might come to you and say, help me kind of figure out this shortcut to finding my own self narrative or my own guidance, and if that's through dreams, then and I've known people and I've met people, I imagine you have, that do have agency over their dreams. That's like, I think that there's a particular name or phrasing for that, but I feel dreams are such an interesting particular kind of case, because and I've a lot of ideas that I've had for creating something have come out of just that brief window between dream and awake that allows us to kind of remember, if not the plot, the feeling that we had in a particular dream. I guess I would say the only thing that you could possibly tell somebody that wants to have more agency over their dreams is to have a greater openness in the things that they do and the ways that they connect to people in the world in their waking life, right? Because where do we get the fodder for our dreams but in the experiences that we have in the and I feel like even some you mentioned the idea of love in a little earlier in our conversation. Like I find kind of emotion and gut feeling that I remember having in dreams is tied to only knowing what that emotion is when I'm awake, kind of thing, and being able to point to it and say, oh, that's interesting, and maybe there's something here that I can bring this into my work and into my storytelling to allow an audience that might come to a show that I've directed to say, oh, I really felt this at this moment, and often, like I say, that's my intention, to connect to an emotional life, an inner life, recognition of things that make up the ways that we kind of grapple with everything that happens to us on any given day.
Well, let me point out something that you're implicitly stating. You're talking about love. And I want to go back to, you said that part of your narrative is community, how important community is. And so whether we're talking about love or whether we're talking about community, I think implicit then is a sense of having, I know this is an unscientific way of saying it, but a sense of living with our hearts open.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about having a warm, fleshy human heart that allows that flow of creativity and spirituality to happen. That I don't think that creative genius can flow when our hearts are closed and cut off from human experience, cut off from the highs and the lows of life. All of that mixed together creates an opening for that stream of creativity and that stream of grace to flow.
I think that's totally, I mean, in my experience, that's totally true. And even in while you were talking, I feel like there's an element of being seen, being recognized by others, by partners, friends, collaborators, etc. Like I mean, you know my partner Jen, and I've been in an incredible relationship for almost 5 years now, and I feel like I've never been more openly kind of creative and been able to tap into a fuller expression of myself than in the time that I've had the support and recognition of theater work, and I'm sure part of your experience in working in the written form. There's so much of you're doing that for yourself at the time that you're doing it, right?
Yes.
I think visual art has that same connection, music composing, but then you're also exploring that side of yourself so that you can be, it's not created in a vacuum. It helps allow you to continue to have the drive to do that work if you're being seen and recognized for, and I'm not talking about fame. I'm not talking about like the kind of the celebrity connection to artistic work, which can come, can be a part of some people's experience of developing that part of their, soul. But just that person in your same household that's going to turn and say, "Oh, you really worked hard today," "Oh, I got like 4 pages out, but I'm really happy with how the scene is flowing," kind of thing, right?
Yes.
That can kind of make it all worth it, maybe even more than the, all right, I'm gonna get this play out there and it's gonna be the hot thing on Broadway this year and I'm gonna be famous from it, right?
All right, so let me, we could go on and on, but I want to pick up on something that you're saying that, again, it's implicit, but it's so profound that, and again, I'll connect this with a spiritual concept, but it's about being seen, and not just sort of on a superficial level, on an egoic level, or the level of the persona. It's being seen, somebody seeing and recognizing something that is essential in us, something that is vital in us, something that is meaningful in us. And whatever that is, this most vital part of us, the part of us that is the most alive, and it can be alive in suffering and it can be alive in joy, but that part of us that is most alive is, I think, the part of us that is most godlike. That is the divine spark in us. And when people can see that and mirror that back to us and celebrate it, it gives us permission then to let it shine more.
Yeah.
And again, I think that is where that creative spark comes from. Ultimately, it comes from the deepest, most soulful part of who we are. And again, you could sort of say it in a secular way. It's our most authentic self. A spiritual way, it is that spark of the divine that is us. And we do need other people to mirror it back to us. and to celebrate it with us. And then it's easier to live out of that in our everyday lives when we have
Yeah.
that contact with what is most essential in us.
Yeah, I think that's right. And or at least that's the way that I experience what you're talking about, and call these conversations wrestling with God. And I haven't had the opportunity to listen to as many of your past podcasts. I know this is something that you've just gotten started recently, right? I'm really excited to listen to conversations that you've had or are going to have with those that connect on the more religious and side of the spiritual that does come from a practice in that form of the word, right? That's not the kind of practice that I build into my life. I would never be a person that would say, oh, that's somebody silly for having that approach to the ways that they connect to the spiritual in their own lives, right? I mean, I think we all find it, we try to find it in the way that works for us, you know?
Yeah, and I think, and other podcasts, I will, kind of wrestle more with explicitly spiritual practices and religious concepts. But having said that, Evan, one of the things that, and I've known you for a while now, obviously, and one of the observations that I make about you often within myself, but also when I, talk about you to your mom is, and no, you don't use a lot of religious language. You don't use, I don't think you have any, formal religious practices that you participate, at least on a regular basis. But there is a sense of the spiritual, of the transcendental, of the creative spirit that we're talking about that just seems to be a regular part of a normal part of your life that I will sometimes say to people that Evan is kind of just organically operates from a level of enlightenment. It's just part and parcel of who you are, that you're awake, you're aware, you're honest, you're authentic, you have a good heart, you have an open heart. And so you may not always express yourself or your thoughts about God vis-a-vis traditional religious propositions. But I think that you live your life in spirit, in grace, in light.
I mean, those are beautiful things to be said about oneself, and I really appreciate that. It's a little hard, but to humbly accept those compliments. I will do my best. It's hard to say yes, all the things that you're saying about me are true, but I appreciate that you have that perspective of kind of the in another kind of term of the word, the spirit that I bring to
Yes.
to my day to day and when I'm around people and what I try to share.
There's a line by Jesus. I like a lot of lines by Jesus, but there's one that fits in.
He was a good one. He was a good storyteller, right?
He was a great storyteller. And it fits what we're talking about. He said, not everybody who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of my Father, but those who do the will of my Father. And what's the will of God, quote unquote? It's to live an honest, loving, charitable, creative life that gives back.
Yeah.
And that's not a proposition. That is something that we participate in. It's an experience.
Yeah. No, that's so true. And, anything that you are saying about me, even, the idea of a good heart or as you were talking, the thing that I really recognize is how am I able to offer any of that if I am, but for the experience of having received those things throughout my life, right? Like I I don't, like you say, I don't really have a habitual, regular spiritual practice in the religious sense. That's part of my life. But I've known goodness, right? I've
Yeah.
seen positivity. I've experienced support, and I look to times like when I had my injury. And if I'm frank and honest, I didn't turn to God at that time. I experienced something positive and forward moving and maybe godlike in the dedication and support of my family at the time, that was able to say, this is not the end of your life. Let's find the resources that will allow you to grapple with what it means to be living in a different physical body and find the ways to adapt to that. My parents, my aunts and uncles, my friends at school and in the theater, coming to the hospital at that time, looking towards the things that would be possible for me to do again rather than the things that I'd lost, right? In that experience. Even coming to New York and being new to a city here, and actually, not having any family or friends in this particular area, and it takes time to kind of evolve to what it is to navigate your way through uncharted waters, kind of thing. And some years in, I found my partner, and I recognize the kind of goodness and support and kindness, and yes, go ahead and make that decision that's going to feel more fulfilling in your artistic life, even if it is a choice that might not be the choice of greater immediate financial security, that kind of thing. The kinds of, I honestly, I think one of my favorite words and my favorite ideas is grace. The kinds of grace that I've experienced, received, and in the receiving of it, the recognition of that as something that I can then offer in return to others, is a way that I look at this from the perspective of how am I going to live my life.
It's interesting that the word grace is really one of my favorite words, and it's always bouncing around in the back of my head. I think sometimes we have a constricted notion of grace, but everything that you're describing, particularly around your injury, but even after your injury in your life now, the love, the goodness, the support, the encouragement that you have received and continue to receive, the fact that you see that as grace, as gift, I think that helps to keep your heart open and to keep that flow of creativity open and
Can I
flowing.
say,
Sure.
I think I also recognize it as a kind of privilege too. I
Yes.
recognize it as something that's not built into the experience of all people, right? I've had elements of a privileged existence and experience, right? I wasn't, born destitute. I wasn't necessarily opportunities have come along in my life that are not the opportunities that come along for all people, right? And so I feel like not only in recognizing it when it arises and when it allows me to, feel connected to something, but also that there's a necessity in kind of finding my own particular way to share that with those that maybe haven't had the luck or the circumstance of that experience, that support. And I'm not Mother Teresa. I'm not often in third world countries, kind of helping in that way, is it's a question that I often ask myself. Is theater and the arts, is it enough is it important enough to try to make change
I
and positive,
I think
be a positive element in people's lives?
I think it absolutely, and I've said this to you, I said it earlier in our conversation, your profession, when it's done right with intelligence and with love, it's a profound gift that you give back to that you yeah, it gives you the opportunity to give back.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I hope
Yeah.
so, and that's why I do it. But it doesn't come without questioning. It doesn't come
Well, the fact
without kind of taking stock and saying, is there something more I could be doing? Is there something different I could be doing?
well, the fact that you question, I think, keeps you open to that river of grace.
Hmm.
If we once we stop questioning, then we kind of become a closed system. Uh, and
Yeah,
and so I think questioning is part of how we continue to stay in the flow. I think when I'm on my deathbed, I'm still going to have some questions, and that's part of what keeps us alive. So we have to move towards a conclusion with this, but just one more thought that, again, you just sparked a lot. This whole thing with what do we do with privilege? And again, there's a line from Jesus that I think applies. He says, to whom much is given, much is expected.
hmm.
That some of us do have more in a myriad of ways than other people. And what you're doing with what's been given to you is you're attempting to give back, you're attempting to create truth, beauty, and goodness in the world. And in a paradoxical way, that's what keeps the flow of grace going. That when we truly, in an intelligent and loving way, try to give back and to give to others what we have been given, more comes to us. And
Yeah.
I think that's part of the secret of being in the flow of this creative
Hmm.
energy, this
But
creative elan.
and you asked me early on, just about my more recent experience in working with actors with disabilities, and I feel like, some of the element of that's a fairly new kind of part of the exploration. I think for me, and in a lot of the arts and a lot of the parts of our kind of cultural world right now, is, whose stories are we telling, right? And if I'm developing a play that has some particular truth to me, that can become more universal, right? Like the closer that I get to an experience of something true and sharing that experience with my audience, that then makes that experience, something wider than just that individual thing that I'm connecting with, right?
Yes.
But I also, I think sometimes even the theater world can has in a way insulated itself, become, drifted towards becoming that closed system that you talk about, and finding ways of having greater representation and inclusion of race and class and gender and ethnicity in the different kinds of stories, right? Finding ways of who are the actors that are the representatives of this story that I'm telling, and what do they look like, and what is their actual life experience, and that this trying to be a little bit more expansive and open in what I guess what my curiosity about the world, right? Being a little bit more curious about the experiences of people that are not me, and finding ways of sharing both my true experience and a little bit more expanded and open-minded, you know.
Every time you say something, it sets me off if I'm saying we could be talking for hours, but just what you're
And
saying.
we have, haven't
Yes,
we?
almost. What you're saying right now about, really, the word I would give it is empathy.
Hmm.
That being able to kind of cross barriers and enter into other people's experiences, I think that is an evolutionary leap that the human race needs to really make. It doesn't mean we always have to be in agreement with each other, but to be able to enter into another person's world and have a level of understanding, compassion, and acceptance of is probably one of the virtues, this virtue of empathy that I think the human race needs in order to continue to evolve in a truly good way. And just to bring this full circle is, I think that is what you do in your vocation as a director and as a playwright and as a pioneer in terms of creating, theatrical space for people with disabilities.
I appreciate you saying that, and I feel like empathy is another one of the few particular words that I do try to allow to kind of come back into my heart as often as possible. And I appreciate you kind of framing the way that can kind of bring us full circle, because I really do believe that the arts and that storytelling is one of the greatest tools that we have to allow for empathy and understanding and sharing of beliefs through, a theater performance is people sitting in a group with other members of their own community having a shared experience. And yeah, where else does that happen? That happens in churches and synagogues and other at the Assisi Institute and beyond, right?
Yes.
It feels to me, when you talk about it that way, it's so obvious the way that some of the work that I do connects to something spiritual.
Yeah. So maybe the last thing I'll say, and in some ways this encompasses, I think, a lot of our conversation. God is a mystery that is endlessly knowable. But I think we know it by participating in the river, in the stream of that mystery, by yielding to truth, beauty, and goodness and love. And as you were saying, to give what we have been given to others. Any final thoughts, Evan, that you want to share?
I guess all I would say is, and I said it just in a brief way earlier, but I'm nothing if I'm not the combination of the influences in my life and of the ways that I've recognized goodness and empathy coming to me from others. You are absolutely one of the people that I recognize so much of that in, and of course my mother is another, and my partner Jen is another. I think I just appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk through and think through some of these things with, certainly one of the smartest people that I know in you, but also just someone who, as you say, on your deathbed, hopefully many, many decades from now, you're still going to be looking at and thinking about and asking questions of what was all this, and I find a lot of joy in being able to ask questions in your presence and bounce off questions and ideas with you. I don't know that we always come to many, if any, answers, but that's the joy in exploring some of this, isn't it? To be able to ask the question and let it be okay that further questions come from it without having to come to any conclusions that stop the conversation.
Yeah, there's a spiritual teacher, name is Amos. He he talks about enlightenment. He calls it runaway enlightenment, that there's never an end, that there'll be more mystery to unfold, to be experienced, that will lead us to more mystery and more mystery, that we will spend eternity discovering new levels of mystery and meaning. And so I'll end it with that. Evan, you know, you're one of my favorite people in my life, and I have nothing but love and respect for you. And I thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today and your curiosity, and look forward to seeing you over Christmas.
Thanks, Greg. Happy to be a part of this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.